how are we all doing on our books? It seems like most of you have the book already. And, as usual, I do want to say, I want this time together to be one of conversation. I really learned so much from all of you with your questions and your comments. So please don't deprive me of my education. Do not hesitate to jump in, because I don't know, I just don't want to hear myself talk all the time. And we're having this is such a august group of scholars. But anyway, we're looking at Spong's text, which Mac informed us last time was written prior to the text that we just got finished reading on biblical literalism. And Spong, introduces his whole interest in the Gospel of John, and he said that one of the things that has followed him throughout his life is he never really was very much interested in John, primarily because it's a foundation, and it's true. It's the foundation of many of the creedal statements. For example, the Nicene Creed, where it says Jesus is fully God and fully human, true God of true God, light from light, all of those high Christological statements that Spong believes have not served the church well. In fact, they've been the foundation of imperialism since the mid, 4th century of the Common Era. So he was a little bit surprised that he was able to take this interest in the Gospel of John. And last time, I just want to remind everybody, just a little refresher on what we know about how the Gospels were written. They were not written in the time of Jesus. They were written probably a full generation after Jesus, with Mark coming first. And then Matthew, as we saw in our last class, was explaining Mark and building on that, and according to a liturgical calendar that was followed in the synagogue. Luke was written a little bit after Matthew, and it appears that Luke had some of the same source material that Matthew had. He had Mark at his disposal, and he also had, it's hypothesized, this document called Q, which is a group of sayings. So if you look at how the so-called synoptics were written, Matthew and Luke both had Mark and this sayings source available to them, and they wrote their gospels to particular communities. Matthew had a particular community, Matthean community that we call it, and there is some material in Matthew that's very unique to Matthew. Luke also had a Gentile community that he was writing to, a Gentile Christian community, and thus includes some material in his gospel that cannot be found elsewhere. But when we get to the Gospel of John, we are in a entirely new land. It's like we come through the looking glass, because all of those stories that we read about in Jesus and the chronology that we read about in Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels seems to be just thrown to the wind. And Spong makes the point that in some ways, this thing seems kind of cobbled together, the Gospel of John. And I talked briefly about this last time. John is different in a number of ways. It's written in a very easy Greek to understand, something known as Koine, meaning common Greek. It's in the Gospel of John that Jesus has a 3-year ministry. The Gospel of the Synoptic Gospels, it appears that Jesus' ministry lasts for only about a year. The chronology of events in the Gospel of John is completely different. In fact, this Spong makes a very good list of these differences at the end of chapter 3. That chapter is called. Oh, darn it! I thought I had it. Well, but you can review this. Excuse me for a minute. I'm trying to find the right. You can review some of these differences on page 26, 27, and 28, the things that separate the Gospel of John out. No transfiguration. The Last Supper does not appear to have been a supper where Jesus broke bread and poured wine and talked about his body and the blood, but it was a foot washing. that comes, and it doesn't happen at Passover. It doesn't appear to be a Passover meal. And also, the one thing that really kind of flummoxes our students is that the crucifixion of Jesus does not happen on the day of the Passover, but the day prior to Passover. And this is because John wants to make certain statements about who Jesus is. Much of that we talked about last time, but when we left, we were talking about some of the so-called high Christology that you also find, and I'll mention what that refers to, that you also find in the Gospel of John. John begins with this prologue. The first 14 verses, you probably know it very well, and it is modeled on the first chapter of Genesis. You know, the first chapter of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form, on and on and on. John appears to be writing a new kind of creation story. In fact, he's establishing a new theological way of understanding the creation when you read his prologue. In the beginning was the word. Ha logos is the Greek word. And this word has halagos, has a very distinctive meaning in its Greco-Roman context. It would be about this time and a little bit later that the Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, for example, would talk about this logos, where we get our word logic from, or this order, this means of ordering the world. It pervades the entire world. And one must take on a kind of, one must try to, in Stoicism I'm talking about, one must try to conform one's will to the will of the cosmos. So there is in the cosmos this order. And John appears to be in some way aware of that. The Gospel of John appears to be some way aware of that. We also know that this word, this logos, was referred to in the Essene community as well. But John writes this new prelude to the gospel as a kind of a creation account. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was this ordering principle to the universe, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is high theology, right? We're talking about something that pre-exists before creation. In fact, all of creation is created through this Word. Well, this Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, and the world knows it not, but nevertheless, this is the Messiah, who is not just a fully human figure who's carrying out God's will as the anointed one, but we're talking about incarnational theology. This is the Word that's in the beginning becoming flesh, and that becomes a foundation. That prelude alone, in many ways, becomes the foundation of later creedal statements and what we call incarnational theology. This idea that God becomes a man. And I think I mentioned last time, we see this in Philippians 2 as well, where Jesus did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself and takes on the form of a servant. Any insights or questions about that before I move on? That's kind of a quick overview of what we talked about last time. There is one other interesting aspect to the Gospel of John, and that is a character that's in the Gospel who has kind of a mysterious identity. We think we're not really sure who this person is, but he's referred to as the beloved disciple. And he's kind of placed over against Peter, whereas Peter is always, never understanding what Jesus is saying. The beloved disciple has like this intuitive understanding of what's happening, and he is the disciple that Jesus loves the best. And if you look at Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, I'm sorry, I should have put it up here for us, but if you look at the Last Supper, you will see that there is a disciple who has his really kind of feminine features that's resting his head on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. And this is taken right from the Gospel of John. This is the beloved disciple. This is the foundation of what we know today as Celtic spirituality, because it's this Gospel of John, or I should say it's this beloved disciple in the Gospel of John that, what a beautiful poetic image, is listening to the heartbeat of God, who rests his ear on the breast of Jesus and hears the heartbeat of God. That's a mystical understanding of this gospel. And so that prologue, as I said, becomes a kind of early creed for the church. And the beloved disciple becomes, kind of this mysterious person who understands Jesus in a way that nobody does, as if to say the Gospel of John understands Jesus in a way that the other Gospels do not. So that's where I'd like to stop from now. Let me see if I can move on. And last week, Mac made the suggestion that we establish what it is that is referred to in our title, Tales of a Jewish Mystic. Mac, I don't think you know what a can of worms you opened up, because when I was in graduate school, this was one of my areas of specialty, and that is the Platonic mystical tradition. So I can tell you more than you ever want to know about this, and I'll try to keep it brief. But Spong is making a claim about the Gospel of John that might need a little bit of unpacking before we begin. And he refers to the author as a person writing tales and of a Jewish mystic. He is a person who is who understands God in a different way. And then I wrote this definition. I'm sure you can find better or other definitions, but I just wrote down and wrote what I thought was a good understanding of this term mystic or mysticism. But it's an orientation towards God that really is in many ways contrary to what we understand in the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition, we're all about creeds, we're all about rational understanding of God and making sure that we can logically express who Jesus was, and even though sometimes it ends up being paradoxical. But mysticism tries to set words aside, because words ultimately fail to understand and to describe who God actually is. So in my definition, mysticism is a form of religious experience and devotion whose foundation rests on coming into a relationship with the being of God, or what Tillich called the ground of being, so that one's individual ego and identity are completely subsumed in the experience, becoming one with God. This oneness can be experienced through the spiritual discipline of contemplation and meditative prayer. Think about the beloved disciple resting his head on the breast of Jesus. This is a form of listening, right? Trying to hear what God has to say to you, not so much in words, not so much in creeds, but in a kind of intuitive understanding of who God is. Mysticism provides a direct, intimate knowledge of the divine on a level that is beyond the intellect. So if I can introduce this term, it is non-theistic. And this is what really strikes Spong, because in our Christian tradition, historically, and I would say in the Judaism that precedes this, we have been taught to think of God as a being set apart from other things. In other words, an object, ultimately, if you want to think about it, distinct from ourselves, that we can pray to, that we can try to describe intellectually, all those kinds of things. But God is a being. In mysticism, the idea that God is being itself. God is not an object, but God is the pure subject who can be experienced through the purest form of subjectivity, which means releasing any notion of yourself as an object, an ego, and becoming part of that subjectivity that is God. And so God is not apart from us, but is a part of us. God can be known through introspection. God can be known through inner reflection. God is at the heart of one's true self. And so this has not been a dominant tradition throughout Christian history, though it has been present. And many mystics have been deemed heretics because what they ultimately end up doing is challenging some of the tried and true creedal statements of the church, and also to suggest that one can become one with God emphasizes a kind of deification. If you're one with God, that means you are deified, right? And the church doesn't want anything to do with that. They want to make sure that God remains wholly other. Interestingly enough, though, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is a different perspective on this. Salvation is what comes to be known as theosis. That is being, brought up into the presence of God and becoming one with God. So one of the things that separated the Western from the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church really has a much more mystical understanding of the human relationship with Christ, who is the intermediary between humans and God. So I'll just name some of these names. You may have heard them in the past. Famous Christian mystics, starting early on, Pseudo-Dionysius. In fact, we can go back to the early church fathers, but these are some of the people that I studied and know best. Pseudo-Dionysius, Hildegard of Bingen, who is, a female mystic who is responsible for this image I have on our PowerPoint presentation. She lived in mostly in the 12th century. Meister Eckhart, who lived in the subsequent century, who is probably one of the best known mystics. There are two monks at St. Benedict Center in Schuyler who have their PhD in Eckhart studies. So if you ever really want to pursue Eckhartian mysticism, that's the place to go. Later on, the 16th century, while the Reformation was going on, and you can imagine the Counter-Reformation was very, very heady, especially after Thomas Aquinas, several centuries earlier. But there was a movement which was its own counter-Reformation, whether it's in the Catholic or in the Protestant churches. A man by the name of John of the Cross, who talks about the dark night of the soul. And that's that struggle that you go through until you eventually become one with the object of your devotion. And then probably most famously in the 20th century, Thomas Merton, who was I'm trying to think of it, a monk who stays silent, and I can't all of a sudden I can't think of his name, but he in Gethsemane Seminary in Kentucky, who died in 1968, but is very, very familiar to many, especially Roman Catholics who pursue the contemplative tradition. Spong is going to claim that what the gospel writer is doing is going to be very, very closely tied to what this minority tradition in the Christian faith has pursued in their in their thinking. So any comments about that or questions?
Yeah, Dan, thinking back on our icons that we wrote
Right.
more than several years ago. That was one of the an enlightenment to me, and basically my introduction to mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been with me ever since. It's something that I've been toying with ever since. But that writing those icons and that connection with spirit,
Right.
but was a real eye-opening experience.
Yeah, and that is, we were writing them in the Prosopan tradition, which is Russian Orthodox, but just the Eastern Orthodox Church in general, whether it's Greek, Russian, Syrian, Coptic, does focus on this idea that in this world we can encounter God. This world is a sacrament and a means by which God can be experienced. But more specifically, God can be experienced in an inner way through contemplation and through praying. Now in the West, especially in the Protestant tradition, we have vilified icons because we call them, these objects or idols that the Orthodox pray to. No, you don't. You're not praying to the icon. You're using the icon as a vehicle, as an entree into the Spirit of God. It's fascinating, as you know, Chuck, and we had a great time doing it. Because when you were saying writing icons, most people would see that as painting icons, but really what you're doing is you're putting down layer upon layer of ink and producing something that kind of looks, let me see, like this. There's a Russian Orthodox icon. That becomes a window to the divine.
And I've also,
go ahead. Yeah.
And I've also described the writing of an icon as basically a liturgy.
Yes. Yeah. Very much. Will, you wanted to say something.
And thanks to Chuck for that point, but I'm pretty sure, and I have a really weak understanding of mysticism, but I'm pretty sure I can't go to you, Dan, and say, teach me to be a mystic. It all has to come from within.
Not necessarily. I can't teach you intellectually. I can't say, this is what a spiritual director does, actually. There's a spiritual director takes you through practices by which you come to a deeper understanding of the presence of God in your life. And that can be prayer, it could be contemplative prayer. There could be Ignatian kind of visualization practices. But this is what Kylie Wenberg did when she was under the auspices of the church. And she still is, I hope, a spiritual director. She's studied at probably the best school in the country for spiritual direction, which is Creighton, a very rigorous program there. But yes, Will, I can't intellectually tell you, I can't explain it intellectually, but I can give you exercises to help you achieve that sense of oneness with God. I mean, one can do that. I can maybe take the first step towards doing it, but I'm not a spiritual director. You want to respond to that, Will?
No, that helps.
Yeah. So
Dan?
Yeah.
Where do feelings come in to this? I mean, do they? Inner feelings?
Yes. Yeah. There's something called the Wesleyan quadrilateral, Joyce. When we begin to try to understand God, there are 4 ways of doing it, says Wesley. And the 4th one of those ways is feelings. The first is through Scripture. You know, we can understand God through Scripture. We can understand God and Jesus through tradition, like the Roman Catholic tradition. Then when we get to the Protestant Reformation, we can understand God using our reason. But the fourth leg of that table on which our faith rests is through experience, through your own, inner experience of God, which is too often discounted because experience is so subjective, right? How do you know if your experience is truly a divine experience or if you're just psychotic, right? But all four of those things, according to Wesley at least, have to be balanced. The reason mystics have not always been respected in the church is because of their inner subjectivity. Their experience they have is a very, very subjective experience and is built in many ways on feeling. And I don't want to say emotion, but it is built on, let's say, intuition. Let's look at it that way. But meditation, for example, is something that can be practiced in the Christian tradition. Its technique is very similar to Buddhist meditation, but the end or its objective is completely different than Buddhist meditation. In Christian meditation, the idea is this achieving this sense of oneness and this intuitive relationship with God who lies at the core of your being. And you come to know God as you come to know yourself. And I think this is similar to what the writer of the Gospel of John. I don't want to get too far away from the Gospel of John, but I do want to give you a pretty good understanding of how mysticism has played a role in the church. Any other questions before I move on?
I just have a comment, Dan. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mac. Yeah.
I think this is a good place to show where Spong's kind of conversion is coming from. I'm not interested in John. It's too weird. I don't like it. By the time he gets done, he has an extremely great appreciation of it. And we can see that phrase that you just took off the board, but basically that said that God is not an object, he's the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's pure subject.
Yeah.
And I think we need to understand the immensity of that observation, because that really changes the entire understanding of the nature of God that people have. I traditionally that we have now. 99% of the people in our congregations would have that. And we had a prior writer, I can't remember if it was Brueggemann or Galston or one of the books that we read, where he talked about, getting away from the idea that God is some old white guy up in the sky.
Yeah.
And that to get away from that conception is a major leap. And Spong as a Tillichian,
Right.
I mean, that's right in his wheelhouse.
Right.
That's where he wants to go. But I think we need to understand, even now, that's a fairly radical concept in, mainstream Christianity.
And boy, we can go into why it's so radical too. But one of the reasons is that it's your inner experience cannot be controlled, nor can it really be objectively assessed, right? According to creedal statements. And if you come to somebody and say, but this is my experience of God, the first thing they're going to do is, well, that doesn't match up with what the Bible says, right? And so people aren't interested or I should say, traditional Christianity is not interested in mysticism because it takes away that factor of control that's been so important to the Christian church since Constantine. Now, this is the source, by the way, of our Taizé contemplative service that we have on Sunday mornings. Even though, and I think Greg gets mad at me when I say this, even though it's not a true Taizé service, because Taizé is about, just meditating and singing, but in the middle of that meditation and singing, we have a sermon, right? And that brings us back to our heads again. But the way that we're doing it, I think, is a nice, really real balance between head and heart. But one thing I thought of when you were talking, Mac, was this distinction between God as a being, in the 3-story universe, and being itself. Being is something that we all share. We all are. What is the source of that being? Tillich calls it the ground of being. What is the common ground that we all stand on that makes us exist? When you start thinking about this spirit that pervades all of creation, or this reality, this, I can't think of a really good word to describe it, but this richness and this source of all creativity and the source of all humanness, the source of all creation that is at the core of all things. That's a different starting point for helping us to be intersubjective, me understanding Sharon or me understanding Constance. That's a far different starting point than understanding God as a being who is in control of the universe and is manipulating the cosmos in a kind of mechanical fashion, as Aristotle might suggest. It really opens a different door to seeing Jesus in a new way, because let's just imagine that until Jesus, that there was kind of this maybe perhaps murky understanding that there was this shared reality that all of us are a part of. But in Jesus, I'm just kind of spitballing here, and this might be the direction that Spong is going, but Jesus, in his God consciousness, provided a path for us to also embark upon a God consciousness journey. And that has nothing to do with, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, our Lord. All of that rational creedal stuff that Spong says it was a terribly tragic detour in our history. So let's just talk briefly about sources of Western mysticism. And if we really come down to it, the first place we know that there was writing about this was India. There's a book written about oral traditions called the Upanishads. The Upanishads were teachings on the nature of reality. And in India, the idea is in the Upanishads that this perception we have of the world of things, or here's one thing and it's different from this thing, that's all an illusion. Now, we're not talking about Christianity here, okay? But this idea of separation, of differences between me and you and us and them, all of that's an illusion, because at the core of our perception is the reality of the unity of all things. There is something called Brahman, which is known as, the let's call it the ground of being of all reality. And if I look inside myself, I can see something called myself that does not change over time. I always ask students, are you the same person today that you were when you were in kindergarten? And, if you really begin to think about that, it's hard to say, right? Well, all of the cells in my body have sloughed off many times. I don't have the same body. My bones are bigger. My brain has developed, but nevertheless, there is some continuity there between, the 60-year-old Dan and the 5-year-old playing in the sandbox. What is the source of that continuity? And the Hindus would say it's this thing called yourself, or Atman. And if you really begin to look at that thing called yourself, you will come to see that it's not, yourself and then there's somebody else who has another self, but in fact, they're all a part of this great ocean called Brahman. And that understanding about, that was very popular in the Upanishads about the time that Plato would have been born. And it's hypothesized, of course, that, because of trade happening in the ancient world at this time, that eventually these ideas came into the hands of the Greeks. And they were developed primarily by Plato. And you might know about Plato's realm of the forms, where you have ideas that do not change, that our world below are just simply, imperfect reflections of. I don't want to get too much into that, but I do want to get into something that may help us in this, and it's called Neoplatonism. After Plato, there was a philosopher by the name of Plotinus, and he came up with this understanding that really is very similar to the Upanishads in many ways, very similar to Indian philosophy, that when you get down to the deepest core of reality, there is something called the absolute. Now, what we tend to do, I want to show you this image. We tend to think of Plato and Neoplatonism in this way, that at the top of the world, there's absolute reality. But that absolute reality differentiates itself through emanations. Think of a, have you ever been to a wedding where you've got, those champagne, I don't know, they're all stacked on each other, and the champagne seems to be flowing from one cup down to the next cup, down to the next cup, and somehow they've got it in a kind of a return loop. Do you know what I'm talking about? Or that's kind of how Plato, or I should say Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist after Plato, how he saw the world. At the source of all reality is this, what he calls an absolute reality called the One. But because of its fullness, it overflows into the world into something called mind or intellect. And that intellect overflows into the world into something called the soul, and then on down into the physical world. But when you look at the world, there's nothing but the spirit that moves from absolute reality through mind, through soul, down to physical reality, and then back up again. So it's like one of those champagne, fountains. And what we as human beings need to do, according to Plotinus, is through various exercises, is get on that return loop, right? To not see the world in physical terms, as a bunch of differentiated entities, but through a series of spiritual disciplines, return to absolute reality and rest in that absolute reality. Now, what's misleading about this is that it follows this hierarchical pattern that is so distinctive to the Western world. God's at the top, then mind, and then soul, and then physical reality, which is part of our body, right? But really, emanation should look more like this, almost like an atom might, right? At the core of all reality is the ground of being, and then it emanates outward. So you have this expanse and retraction, of which, through your own inner reflection, you can achieve an intuitive oneness with the ground of all being. In the world, there is being, and we can be part of that if we simply follow the right spiritual exercises. If you ever want to, because like I said, I can go forever on this, and but if you ever want to talk about this just in some other way, we can get into it. But it's this is the source of Christian mysticism, but it's a quite different perspective on the world. And this is why Spong is so attracted to it. So any quick questions about that? I went over that rather quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's a rich tradition in Christianity. It's not necessarily heretical. So any questions or comments? I think Denny joined us, or I thought I saw him joining us.
Hi, Dan.
Oh, there you are. Hey,
I finally got through all the password maze.
yeah. So, well, good. Welcome. Glad you're here, Denny.
Thanks.
Well, let's start on chapter 2, which is entitled "One Gospel with More Than One Author." And Spong, and we can go over this rather quickly because I'm sure we'll be talking about this. But when you read the gospel, and if you read it carefully and you try to read it as a narrative, it looks like there are several layers of meaning in the Gospel of John. Or I shouldn't say layers of meaning. I should say it looks as if at least 3 different authors were at work at 3 different times. First of all, the first clue is that on the one hand, there appears to be a rather low Christology. When we say low Christology, we mean an understanding of Jesus as a man, who is a Messiah, who fulfills all the expectations of a Messiah. But there's also this high Christology, right? And Jesus is God. Jesus has clairvoyance. Jesus works in mysterious signs that really point to some higher reality. That's a very high Christology. So if you just take the interaction of high Christology and low Christology just in the Gospel of John, you can see how we could come up with a doctrine that says that Jesus is fully God, high Christology, and fully human, low Christology as well. So there seems to be this tension in the gospel, says Spong. And also, if you read through the gospel and read carefully, you will note that the word miracle is never referred to, or at least I should never say never. But everything else that is accounted as a miracle, this setting aside the laws of nature in order to achieve something that is unnaturally an unnatural objective, feeding 5,000 people, for example, with 2 loaves and 5 fishes, or 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That is a supernatural event called a miracle. But in John, the emphasis is not on the supernatural nature of it, but on the fact that it is a sign of a much higher reality itself. So Jesus feeding 5,000, it's not like, oh, wow, how did he do that? But, oh, wow, what does that mean? What does that mean? What is that pointing towards, right? And so the signs that Jesus performs are, as Spong says, mighty acts pointing to something bigger and more important. But there appears to be throughout the gospel, if you read it, a source that was singularly focused on all of these signs that Jesus performed. Remember the image that we had before, way back when we looked at Q as a source of sayings for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, now the Gospel of John seems to have something similar, called simply a sign source. And it appears to have been comprised chapters 2 through 11. So this sign source probably began with the great introduction to any religious tradition, Jesus turning water into wine, I've always wondered how the Temperance Society got away with that, or got through that one, and goes through chapter 11, Jesus performing all these signs. And also there are stories that are just kind of thrown in that don't seem to follow from what has preceded it. This is something that I had never known, that Spong points out. That story of the woman taken in adultery, where they bring a woman to Jesus and they caught her in the act of adultery, and Jesus is kind of fiddling on the ground, drawing in the dust. And he says, well, let he who is sinless throw the first stone. And they walk away, put in their place. That doesn't appear in any of the early manuscripts of John. I never knew that. So I learned something new. It was nice. But it's a good example of how, you could just throw this in, and it was, there was nothing leading up to it and nothing following it. It just seemed like the narrative that's cobbled together. The same with the discourses, the farewell discourses that I'm sure we will talk about. But Spong comes to the conclusion that if you read the Gospel of John, and this is where we'll conclude today, it really appears that it was a gospel written in 3 stages. The first of these stages was when the followers of Jesus were still worshiping in the synagogue. And they were, much like Matthew was doing, trying to profess their faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And this inner core would have probably been written around 75 of the Common Era, shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple caused just an incredible earthquake, earthquake ripple effect through the Jewish community. People were trying to understand who they were. And in the midst of that, you had followers of Jesus saying, well, Jesus was the Messiah. You don't need the temple anymore. We've got this new teaching. And they're saying that and saying it rather enthusiastically really piqued the ire of many of the Jews in the synagogue who couldn't conceive of a Messiah who was crucified on the cross. And so eventually there came to be a rift between followers of Jesus in the synagogue and those who wanted to remain traditionally Jewish and still try to figure out how they were going to be so without the temple. And you can see evidence of this rift happening in the Gospel of John as well. This is the gospel where the Jews are referred to in rather, vilified terms, And then finally, and this is the place, and Spong doesn't give a date for this, but I'm going to just guess it's probably around 100 to 125 of the Common Era. He discerns a strand of literature in the Gospel of John where he sees the followers of Jesus trying to distinguish themselves, not as who they're not, right? We're not Jews of the synagogue, but in this new way, in a universalizing way. And this is where I'd like to conclude with his quote. This is on page 18. It's at this time that Jesus' followers who wrote the Gospel of John, they understood that they needed to ground their Jesus experience in something more universal than what their Jewish background and expectations could provide. It was in this third editorial phase that they began to move into a form of Jewish mysticism that enabled them to pass beyond all the tribal boundaries and to reach a new and transcendent sense of the reality of God. In other words, there is this ground of being that we all share that transcends tribalism, which separates so much of us. Let's interpret Jesus through that understanding. That's what gave to this final form of the gospel its high Christology. That high Christology in turn was used in later Christian history to define Christian orthodoxy. The followers of Jesus had to learn to live apart from Judaism. And I'm increasingly convinced, says Spong, that the followers of Jesus today must, in a similar fashion, learn how to live apart from Christianity, at least the kind of Christianity that rests on the creedal statements that we're talking about here. So this is where we are, just at the end of chapter 2. There's a lot of really rich material here, but you can see Spong moving towards a new understanding of Jesus as informed by the Gospel of John. Any questions or comments about this? and I hope I haven't muddled the waters too much. I didn't talk about a Jewish text that is a mystical text that's quite popular today, actually called the Kabbalah. I won't spend too much time on it next time, but it's not really clear when the Kabbalah came around, but it's if you read it, there are certainly Neoplatonic undertones, you might say. And it may be that there was a form of Jewish mysticism that eventually grew into the 12th century Kabbalah that was present at this time as well. And so this is what I want to hear from Spong. I want to hear what the source of this mysticism was. Or did it just spring, ex nihilo or out of nothing from, this group of people? I can't imagine that he would state that. So any comments? Well, if not, continue to read. We'll probably look at chapters 2 and 3 next time. Chapter 2 really is talking about some of the things that we've already mentioned about how John is distinctive from the other gospels. But then when we get into chapter 4, we look at the Palestinian Jewish origins of the gospel. So thank you for indulging me. I know I made an executive decision to read this book. I just wasn't ready to stop reading Spong with our last text. So thanks. I will see you all next Wednesday. Good to see you.